Hi everyone, and welcome to our book seminar on exploring teacher recruitment and retention. I'm delighted that you could join me and join our chapter authors from the book. I'm sad to say that Rowena can't join us today. She's not feeling very well, and our love goes to Rowena and hope she feels better soon. But she's with us in spirit, and we're looking forward to talking with you and sharing with you all of the exciting evidence that we've collected within this edited edition of Exploring Teacher Recruitment and Retention. Our speakers come from a range of areas, and we've split it into two sections, England and internationally. And we have Professor John Howson, who is Chair of TeachVac, Georgina Newton, Associate Professor at the University of Warwick, Sarah Une, who is Professor in Education Innovation at De Montfort University, and Lucy Stokes, who is Principal Economist at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. For our speakers looking at international contexts of teacher recruitment and retention, we've got Bart Crisp, who is Senior Research Manager at Curie, Hongyang Li, who is Professor at Northeast Normal University in China, Smarda Denitsa-Schmidt, who works at the Kibbutzim College Education in Israel and is Associate Professor there. And lastly, Dr. Phil Roberts, who's Associate Professor at the University of Canberra in Australia. So why is this book needed? It's been interesting actually to look at the changes of perception around teacher recruitment as we've gone through COVID-19 and what that's meant, particularly in England, for teacher recruitment and teacher retention. So there have been arguments that we no longer have a crisis in teacher recruitment and retention within England specifically, because we've had such increased numbers of trainee teachers applying to become teachers within our country. This said, there's lots of evidence both in England, across the four nations and internationally to demonstrate that in times of economic recession and in times of economic stress, what happens is that many people who are graduates or are looking for graduate level jobs will go to the public sector because it seemed to be a more resilient and better opportunity for sustained employment. However, what we found is that over the years, as the economic recession becomes less prevalent and economic recovery takes place, that those who may have gone into teaching to look for more stability or a better paid job during that previous recession will leave teaching, and we're left with issues of trying to recruit and trying to retain new teachers and more teachers than we ever needed before. And I think we learned that in 2010 actually from the Hutchinson report, where he really did demonstrate that there was an issue with a recovering economy and loss of teachers into the private sector as graduate jobs became more freely available. So I think, our book is quite timely in that what we've identified are issues relating to workforce supply, both within England, but also without of England in terms of international contexts and how the way in which supply is controlled really does impact on teacher recruitment and retention in all of those countries. We therefore hope that what we've done within our book is provoke thinking about what causes crisis in teacher supply in order to achieve quality education for all. We don't believe that the pandemic is a solution to teacher recruitment and retention. We know, for example, in England, we've got a rising roll coming in 2023 to 25, and that actually means the increased number of pupils that will be coming into secondary school will need a quality workforce to support them in achieving what they need to achieve, and hopefully this levelling up agenda that we've seen to be growing in momentum within our country. Internationally, we need to really start thinking about teaching as a profession, not teaching as a market. We've got real concerns across our authorship about the way in which teachers are perceived as a commodity which needs to be controlled and I think, what's the word I'm looking for? Controlled and supported by government intervention rather than being geared to understanding by the profession itself. So without further ado, the order of today is going to start with John, talking about shortages and a historical overview, really, of exploring workforce supply in England. Then Georgina is going to share with us her inquiries around why teachers leave in England. Sarah's going to be quite specific in looking at communities of practice and the way in which education technology has influenced teacher recruitment and retention. And then Lucy is going to share their work on understanding coastal communities in relation to recruitment and retention. From the international perspective, we're going to start with Bart, who's going to look at the work that Curie's done in investigating professional learning and the way different regions across the globe have responded to professional learning and the impact that that's had on teacher recruitment and retention. Then Hongang's going to share his research that looked at free teacher education within a Chinese context and whether that provided a solution in China and what we can learn from that. Then Smarda's going to share what she found in Israel between the Jewish and the Arab educational sectors and how that's impacted on both teacher shortages and actually teacher surpluses and how that works together. Then we're going to end with Phil, who's going to talk about the way in which rural schools within Australia have been impacted upon about kind of cosmopolitan, metrocentric thinking on teacher recruitment and retention. I'm really looking forward to today. I hope you've got lots of questions to ask, and we're going to go straight over to John. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and it's a great privilege to start this off. You raised some very important issues in your introductory remarks. I called this shortage what shortages because it was a phrase once used by a civil servant when I was pointing out that I thought there was going to be a teacher supply problem in the future. It's historically, as you said, been a real roller coaster, and I'm having difficulty seeing how to move my slides onwards. So could somebody please move me on to the next slide? Got it now, thank you. So there you are. In the 70s, 90s, and after the economic crisis had settled down in 2008, between 2013 and last year, there was a shortage. In the 80s and the 2000s, there were periods when there was a supply potentially surplus. This is a diagrammatic representation. But if we look at two subjects, interestingly, two subjects that used to largely train their teachers through undergraduate routes, which have had to join the other secondaries, subjects in largely working with a graduate population. One is PE, where there's never been a problem in recruiting people into training. But even there, if you look at the 2021 ITT census, that's those who are finishing their courses and will be starting teaching in September. There was a COVID bounce even there. And you can see that in relation to the number of vacancies, which we collect in TeachBack. The DfE reckons that about half of most subjects' vacancies are filled by new entrants to the profession coming out of teacher preparation courses. There is far more oversupply in PE pretty well every year. There was a slight increase in the demand in 18-19, but even there was more supply than necessary. And then if you look at the other side of the picture, the traditional, really difficult to recruit subject over the last 20 years, design and technology, there was a bounce there. The COVID bounce took us back over 500 trainees or teachers in preparation for the first time since certainly the last economic crisis. But if you compare that in recent years with the number of vacancies that there have been, and I admit that that includes re-advertisements where schools were trying again and again to fill a post, there was far more demand than there was supply in pretty well every year. So, who's responsible for dealing with the consequences of that? Well, government has clearly got a big responsibility. It's responsible for identifying how many trainees they are going to fund. It's responsible for school funding and therefore deciding how the money is going to be spent by schools. Employers have an important role in terms of their policies on recruitment and retention, particularly the growing number of large multi-academy trusts. Higher education has a role to play through its curriculum. If its curriculum diverges radically from what is taught in schools, it becomes more difficult to find an alignment between graduates and their degrees and the subjects that we need to teach in schools. And schools clearly also have an implication by the curriculum that they design or is forced upon them. And that helps to identify whether or not the demand is going to be what the government thought it was going to be when it designed the number of training places. And then there are a whole lot of other people who have a part to play, whether it's Teach First, the church diocese, the independent sector, of course, and then outside bodies like recruitment agencies who are in the game to make money. And of course, we mustn't forget the further education sector. So how do schools find teachers? The dichotomy is between the UK model, which is largely a free market, and the model in some European countries and some American school boards of government direction. And some of the schemes that the government has used to train teachers have been successful, like Teach First and the School Direct fee route. Some of them, like Fast Track and the School Direct salaried route, have not been successful. I think the jury's out on postgraduate apprenticeships. And then there are these minor schemes like Teach Next and Troops for Teachers. So the question is for you, will there be a shortage of teachers in 2022? I give you the chance to decide which of those answers you would like to respond to. I'm told it will take a little while. So far, everybody thinks there will be, but not in the primary sector. So far, I think the general, we're getting more people thinking that there will be a teacher shortage. No, yes, but not in the primary sector. I think it's probably there will be once the bounce from the COVID has worked its way through this year. There are already indications that compared to this time last year, the number of people applying for teacher training between April and May wasn't as great as last year. And tomorrow we'll get the figures for June from UCAS, and we'll know then whether or not the bounce has really started to deflate. And I think it will. I think it will be a very temporary event. And then the market will take us back into a situation where, as Tanya said, we've got a growing school population and we are going to need more teachers in the secondary sector. But with the falling birth rate, we are now going to need fewer teachers on the present funding model in the primary sector. So I would like now, if possible, to be able to move on to the next slide quickly. Thank you. So schools start each September with a fully staffed timetable, and their strategies in a time of shortage to deal with that include cutting timetable hours in some subjects, increasing group sizes, using less well-qualified teachers, or indeed in extremis, removing a subject from the curriculum and replacing it with something else. But where they do things like use less well-qualified teachers, they don't tell the parents. And I think there is probably one more slide to go. And I can't, thank you very much. So the conclusion is, if there are not enough people who want to become teachers, there will be a shortage. How any shortages are dealt with determines how teachers are distributed. And the question really for policymakers at present is, the present system for distributed teachers in England to schools almost certainly won't help the levelling up agenda to be achieved, especially with the present national funding formula and pupil premium arrangement for getting resources to schools. I think there is a big danger that we will still see most of the most precious shortage resources, like teachers of physics, ending up either in the independent sector or in our selective schools or in schools with relatively small amounts of free school meals, as a result of the freedom of choice of teachers to choose where they want to teach and the ability of some schools to increase their own level of resources above what the government funds them. So I'll stop there, and thank you all very much. The final slide was just to give you an idea of the range across the subjects of the number of trainees we've taken into preparation into percentage terms against the government's target. And you can see that even with the COVID bounce in physics, it only went up from 42 to 45% of the places, and that was below what it was 2 years ago, and well below what it was even 5 years ago.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting. And I know that we've got questions coming in to ask you when we come to the end of the section about England. But it is interesting that you've mentioned the national funding formula and pupil premium there as a reason not to really consider where we're going in terms of teacher shortages as a way for levelling up if we could overcome those. So I'm sure we'll get lots of questions relating to that coming in. And so now I'd like to introduce to you Georgina Newton, who's going to talk to us about why teachers leave. Thank you, John.
Hello. I think I've got a little bit of lag here with the slides at my end, so I'll just wait till I can see the little arrows to move me on. But yes, I'm going to talk to you about that the most cheerful of topics, why teachers leave. And my motivation for looking at this is that I totally believe that teaching is one of the best jobs. My study was about why teachers would want to leave and what would it cost and how could we help them to stay. And the supply of teachers into state schools has long been described as a leaky pipeline. Sorry, Meta, could you just move me on? I'm going to rely on you to move the slides. I haven't got control here. And you're about to see a leaky pipeline, a pipeline with leaks in it. It's clear that there are so many points at which those entering or who have entered teaching ask themselves, in the immortal words of The Clash, should I stay or should I go? And I make no apology for the fact that you might spot other song titles in this presentation as well. A study by the National Audit Office has found that of those that enter teaching, thank you for that, of those that enter teaching, 10% fail to qualify each year, 10% enter alternative professions, 15% decide to teach in private schools, and having entered teaching, unfortunately, around about 13% leave after year 1, and in years 2 to 5 also we see a number of people leaving, resulting in around only 12% of teachers actually making it all the way through to retirement. So quite clearly, there's a lot to be done to stem the leaks in this pipeline. And with 18% of teachers reporting their current intent to think about leaving in the next 2 years, and 40% saying the same about the next 5 years, from sources from the National Education Union, retention of the teaching workforce is a priority for the UK and other nations. And of course, we need to understand why this might be. Many teachers who do leave cite the intensification and extensification of teacher workload, the stressful nature of the profession, poor work-life balance, and prioritising care and commitments within their family as the main reasons for leaving. So looking at why they might stay and why they might go, for each of these different kinds of leaving, there are multiple factors. So we need to carefully understand each of these leaks. NFER research by Worth and Van den Brande from 2019 and the NEU from the same year found, like I did, that many teachers who leave cite mostly push factors, such as that intensification and extensification of workload that I've just spoken about, the stressful nature of the profession, poor work-life balance, and prioritising care and commitments within the family. So to summarise, it's broader, deeper, anxiety-inducing, higher volume, and less flexible work. Not a great recipe for teacher retention. And we'll see later that these factors and the emotions they produce have a significant impact on decision making when it comes to the big questions like, should I stay or should I go? But each of these enormous factors has many underlying contributory factors. And I'd like us to have a little bit of time together looking at what some of these reasons might be. And a way of doing this is looking at the 3 whys. So I want you to engage with your inner 5-year-old and ask the question, why? Ask the question why 3 times to get to the real root of the problem. So we're going to say why, and in this case, the answer might not be Delilah. So in your ideas box here, you've got opportunity to write in, and I'd like you just to do some free text on looking at possibly the extensification of teacher workload, and let's think about what the reasons for that might be. So why are teachers saying their work has spread out? Why has it become more extensive? You might think, oh well, in some ways they're doing the work of a social worker. Well, why is that? Why is that? Well, that's because there's less access to the support that might be needed on a local level for safeguarding concerns. And why is that? That's because of a redesignation of safeguarding responsibilities or less funding at a local level for safeguarding support. So the why helps us to drive down to find what the real reasons are. So participants, I make no apology for involving you in this. Please type your idea. So what's extensified about teachers' work, and then why, all on the same line, if you could, please. So the ideas board is up. I know it takes a bit of thinking, doesn't it? I'm going to give you a few moments to think about your responses. COVID, hygiene-related responsibilities. Yes, that's definitely extended, hasn't it? Accountability regimes requiring robust audit trails, providing data. Yes, and why? Perhaps one of the lowest whys there is about because we're committed to this system of competition between schools. Anything further? Pupil wellbeing, yeah. Looking at CAMS, yeah. Inadequate amount of provision in those services. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Philly. Anyone else able to kind of follow the why that might lead us to some of the deeper reasons for the things that teachers are feeling? Yes, why the lack of autonomy, Rosalind? What's caused that? Teachers expected to do a lot more beyond teaching. Thank you. Yes. If someone's written something that you like, you can upvote it. Thank you, Rob. Rob's found the little arrows. That helps to identify how the whys impact on the level of questioning. Well done. Yeah, thank you. I'll let you continue to think about that. But here we highlight some of the reasons that sit behind what's going on. And as well, so there are, you know, these things have got their deep underlying reasons, but one of the things that that I and other researchers have found that it really impacts on the way teachers feel about their job is how much appreciation they get. You know, what it actually feels like to be a teacher. So in 2016, I found that 26% of the teachers who said they might be leaving in the next 2 years, so 26% said that that's what they were thinking about. So I was really interested to find out more from them about what it was they wanted to see in their role that could possibly keep them. And the majority felt that it was appreciation that was missing. So of course we can get, teachers can get appreciation from students and parents, colleagues and peers, school leaders, policymakers and government. And we know from our research that school teachers and staff feel deeply appreciated by pupils, parents and colleagues, that these people they're working most closely with. Education Support found that in their COVID-19 and the classroom report that 61% of teachers felt really appreciated during the first stage of the pandemic by parents and carers. And that's been borne out particularly through the primary sector, by much closer relationships in many cases with parents and carers, which has been a real positive benefit of what's happened over the last year and a half. Yet we know that teachers and school leaders don't feel anywhere near that level of appreciation by important groups like education departments and government, the decision makers with whom they don't have that direct contact. And before this academic year began, when we asked teachers and other education professionals, they felt that if their work had been valued during the pandemic, only 15% said that they felt their work was appreciated by the government. So teachers, school leaders and other school staff have not felt their concerns were reflected. Instead, they felt the direct stress and anxiety that you've alluded to in your comments here of constantly changing government advice over the last year in particular. And this has exacerbated an existing feeling for a great many school staff of simply not being listened to or heard. Creating that culture of appreciation is essential for any school seeking to prioritise the mental health and well-being of its staff. And it will support anybody who's trying to do their best, especially during the pandemic. So as Roxy Music pointed out, circa 1982, Gavin Williamson might be trying hard, but he does need to do more than this. His tweet of last week for Thank a Teacher was there, but more than that is definitely going to be required. And this brings me to my next question to you, and that is, what can the government really do? So we don't just want to critique them, but let's have some practical solutions about what government can really do to show appreciation to teachers in a way in which it will be valued, and that perhaps speaks to some of those things that you mentioned in your earlier comments. So we should have a word cloud coming up. There you go. Thank you very much for your support. Enter a word. What can the government do to show appreciation? There's the question for you now. I'm looking forward to seeing your responses. Trusting, paying them more, backing off, listening, pay rise, listen to teachers. Okay, we've got quite a lot of agreement in the room. Love it. Thank you for your responses. And I'm sure there are many of us who have opportunity to speak to the DfE about these types of things. So these feedback doesn't necessarily just stay here. Hopefully it can move forward, it can move us forward. A recent initiative has been the Wellbeing Charter, produced by the DfE as a result of the expert advisory group that I was able to take part in, and I was pleased to do that. There's a charter for the DfE and one for schools, and it signals the need for change to some of the things that do cause teacher attrition and burnout. A commitment to flexible working, better communication culture, clear behaviour culture, saying no to unnecessary workload and career support are some of the pledges. And if implemented, these should make a difference to what it feels like to be a teacher. And what it feels like really matters. Yeah, if we could go to the next slide, please. The last slide, in fact, Meta, because this is the point I'd like to leave you with. Internal, intrinsic decision making, like the often values-based decision to go into teaching, is how philosopher Ruth Chang describes how we make the difficult decisions in life, like should I stay or should I go? Intrinsic decision making is affected not so much by the transactional domain, the rational weighing up of information. You may quite often have divided the page in half and looked at pros and cons on both sides of the page. That's apparently not how people make this kind of decision, but the affective, what it feels like in the lived experience. So actually the pleasurableness domain. So the decision to teach can be strengthened and underpinned by what it feels like to teach. And that in turn will underpin the desire and commitment to remain in teaching. So the way our politicians, media and leaders treat our teachers really impacts on whether they stay or whether they go. It turns out that pleasurableness, even in teaching, really, really matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgina. That was really interesting. And so much of the work that you've done resonates with research that I've done, looking at particularly early career teacher retention and this idea of, the pleasurability, I think that's such a word, perhaps it's not, the pleasure domain of what we do and what we engage with is so important. And I think that links to confidence as well. So if we find pleasure in it, we have confidence in what we do, it just makes our jobs so much easier in terms of teaching, turning up and feeling that we've done a good job. Thank you, that was brilliant. The questions are coming in. Please do keep asking questions and we will get to those shortly. But now I'd like to introduce to you Sarah Uni, who's going to talk about professional learning communities.
Hello. Welcome everybody and thank you, Tanya. I'd also like to warmly welcome everybody in the webinar today. And I'm the BERA co-convener for this SIG on educational research policy making with my co-convener Rowena Passy, who couldn't be here today, but on behalf of Rowena and Tanya and myself, we are really pleased to have you with us this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. We have got more of these in the pipeline, so please keep a lookout for them. I'm going to follow on from what Georgina's saying about how can we keep teachers in the profession. I was once on a Westminster forum with a panel, and the head of my panel was actually the chief of the National Audit Office, and the topic was teacher recruitment and retention. And he said that our model for training teachers, well, we know there's many models, but the one which involves teacher education based in universities and the PGCE route is actually a very expensive route, particularly if you counter in the bursaries that are giving out for shortage subjects like physics and computer science. And we know that with the attrition rate as high as it is, as Georgina's outlined, that actually this is a real problem for this country. It's a very, very expensive training route and we don't keep teachers in the profession. It's not unique to teaching. I was also very alarmed to find out that also in medicine, I was very surprised to find out that the attrition rate at the end of training for 5 years in medicine was actually 20% failed to actually go into the health service. Now that again is quite a lot if you think of the cost of the training. So I wanted to look here then at how can we create resilience? How can we build that sense of the affective domain, as Georgina was saying? And we've looked at this, myself and Professor Christina Preston, who I worked with on this. We belong to a subject association, sometimes referred to as a learned society. My one is Technology, Pedagogy and Education, which was formerly ITI, which was IT and Teacher Education, which supported ICT teachers in schools. And every subject taught in the curriculum will have its own Teachers Professional Subject Association. For example, we have the ASE, which is the Association for Science Education. There's actually 2 for English, there's another one for maths. Music has their own subject association for music teachers, drama teachers, geography with the Geography Association, and history teachers. And there's also those in the primary phase as well. So we wanted to look at 2 things. What did these learned societies offer teachers, because they're for teachers by teachers, and also what can digital technologies do to help teachers stay in the profession as well, and what happens if you join those 2 together. So we started with, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. By looking at the real world issue that we have more pupils in schools than ever before. Not only do we need to be attracting teachers, we also need to be keeping them because of the cost of training, but also if you have high caliber people, we need to keep them in the profession. But at the same time, being aware that we've got the problem of retaining those staff. And in particular, what we don't want to see is an increase in the number of unqualified teachers in the profession. And this isn't just for England. We know when we'll hear colleagues from other countries that there is an increasing rise in more and more unqualified staff entering the system. I've strongly believed that this should be a graduate profession, and we've already talked about how we really should be a master's profession, or moving to Finland where it's actually a doctoral profession. But for us, what we wanted to do, and I'm going to move on to the next slide, was to look at what the challenges are. I'm just going to go back one slide, sorry. Thank you. What were the issues particularly to do with my subject association in educational technology? And I'm afraid I'm going to say the name, it goes back to Michael Gove. So what happened with Michael Gove in 2012 was that he changed the curriculum from a generic ICT curriculum at Key Stage 1, 2, 3 and 4 with an ICT GCSE into a much more specialised computer science curriculum. There was a consequence overnight that we suddenly needed highly specialised computer science teachers, because the more generic ICT curriculum could no longer be taught by those teachers because you needed special coding subject knowledge to be able to teach computer science. Now, the challenges in recruitment and retention began to emerge after Gove made this curriculum change, and it started and was indicated by a shortfall of 8,000 computing teachers in England, as recorded by the National Audit Office in 2016. Now, in anticipation of a teacher shortfall, a consequence of the curriculum change, the government tasked the British Computer Society and Microsoft to try to attract more computer science graduates into the profession, and those computer science graduates that would be willing to teach in schools, bearing in mind that they can have lucrative careers in other aspects of IT. To do this, the graduates were paid a bursary of 28,000 by the government. It's very hard when you join a PGC to be sat in the hall at the beginning next to a drama or English PGC student who can't afford to pay the rent while you're sitting there with a 28 grand bursary. But even this wasn't enough to tempt computer graduates. And more importantly, of those that did take the bursary, too many who did the one-year training in schools actually went on to leave at the end of that training with the money. And that was reported by Hammond in 2017. Now, although there are no official figures since 2016, so specifically on computer science teachers, Seath published an article in November 2019 entitled, "Are Computer Science Teachers as Rare as Unicorns?" And her evidence from discussion with schools suggests that the recruiting problems have become worse since 2016. And in 2020, ME reports that some schools are now actually dropping the subject of computer science in the face of the challenges to recruit and retrain teachers. So computer science is no longer an entitlement or taught in all state schools now, and we have fewer and fewer pupils taking computer science at Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, sorry, which effectively means that our teaching of any digital literacy skills actually ends at the end of Key Stage 3 now for the majority of children, which is very interesting if you think about the demands for the 21st century. So what we have then is a real world problem, but it isn't just computer science. We know that it is other subjects as well. So in the next slide, what we did here was we got together focus groups to work out what could the subject associations in all the different curriculum areas, including the primary phase, do with education technology that could help support the teachers that are in their communities of practice at a national level What could they do to help keep those teachers in the profession? And from the work we did, we found 7 specific strategies can support. The first one is guidance on ways of working digitally. Well, that's very interesting given that we did this work before the pandemic hit, and that was literally needed overnight when the government shut down schools with an announcement on the Wednesday to take place for the following Monday morning, while teachers were in full-time school on the Thursday and Friday. So suddenly those digital resources were needed. Now, what we believe is that those ways of working digitally, the subject societies can work on within their subject areas. They will develop and can keep sustainable banks of relevant e-resources for teachers. And what's very interesting is that the subject association called the Council for Subject Associations, the CFSA, they are an umbrella organisation in which all the subject associations sit. They approached the DFE at the start of the pandemic and said, each of our learned societies has got both the expertise in the curriculum area and the pedagogic expertise with respect to teaching the subject, and we have resources that could be digitised. The DFE didn't respond to the CFSA. Instead, it approached a particular Matt Chain, who developed the Oak National Academy, and suddenly had teachers very busy creating resources as opposed to using the subject associations that already existed. Now, those subject associations continued to be there to offer support to their teachers, and they can also provide professional development entitlement. They're also there to share research they do on pedagogic based ways of teaching their subjects. They are also looking at ways in which we can develop e-portfolios, because one way of retaining a teacher is in that very first slide that it said teachers want to be appreciated. Being appreciated means being valued, which means valuing a teacher's career across their lifetime, so that a robust CPD program and a way of recording a teacher's credits and work that they do and research that they do that is of value both to them and to their wider network in their subject area can be shared. And it's really important because we know that both CPD is very patchy at a national level, and there is particularly a dearth of evidence in pedagogic ways of teaching, threshold concepts and barriers to learning within specific subject areas. So we do think that there's ways that education technology can be used to support particular subject associations to retain teachers in those areas. And most importantly, by joining a professional community, it enables teachers to build resilience together, and it creates that safe space so that when we are feeling disaffected or we're not sure quite what the best way to do is, we can go to those teachers and say, well, how have you tackled this? Now, this is really important if you take the example of music teachers, where there may only be one in a school, or if you feel it's important to not be siloed and be inward looking, but to look to teachers outside of your own school or locality to look at ways in which your subject can be taught. So it's a way of collaborating, and it's a part of that affective domain where we know that resilience is about having that emotional support that comes from your fellow professionals and your colleagues. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll finish just by saying that we know that those subject associations exist for teachers. We strongly encourage all trainee teachers and newly qualified teachers to join their own subject association. We don't make any claims for quick solutions or technological fixes within subjects. We know that it is challenging. We know that there are opportunities to make more effective use of technology to support teachers, particularly in light of the pandemic and how we have adjusted to that. But we believe that these communities of practice can offer ways of building resilience together. And in my own doctoral research, this is where I saw pedagogic innovation. It was within these networked dialogic opportunities. So we know that it will take time.
Sarah, thank you. That's brilliant. We need to end there. I'm sorry, because we're on such a tight schedule, and I think your final slide really does sum up lovely the way that you've shared all of your research and experience within this area. So thank you, Sarah. And I'd like to now go on to Lucy. So Lucy, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Let's check I can take control of my slides. So yeah, thank you, Tanya. So our chapter takes a slightly different focus, and it actually marks the start of a section in the book that focuses in particularly on looking at recruitment and retention in relation to locational issues and challenges. So with that in mind, we aim to set the scene in our chapter by looking at school context and particularly school performance in coastal communities. And I should say at the start, this is joint work with colleagues, so Jay Candace, who's now at UCLC, Pio Michaela Bonini, and Helen Gray, who's now at the Institute for Employment Studies. So over recent years, of course, we've seen that regional differences in school performance have attracted increasing interest, whether that's about differences between North and South, whether that's about interest in performance of schools in London or other urban areas. And one dimension of regional variation that has been attracting interest has been performance of coastal schools, or on average poorer performance of schools that are located in coastal communities. Alongside that, of course, there's also been broader recognition of challenges facing coastal communities in terms of higher levels of deprivation, fewer employment opportunities, ageing populations, and so on. So in this chapter, we report the results of some analysis that looked at differences in performance of coastal and non-coastal schools, and we aim to examine some of the potential reasons behind this. So teacher recruitment and retention is, of course, one factor that's been highlighted as a challenge for coastal schools. And what we do in this chapter is really aiming to set the scene for some further work within the book that also looks in more depth at some recruitment and retention challenges that are faced by coastal schools. So I'm going to start by showing you a couple of slides just to give you an overview of differences in performance between schools that are located in coastal communities and those that are located in non-coastal communities. And this was a selection of attainment measures for based at Key Stage 4 back in 2015. So apologies, our analysis is from a little while ago now. And indeed, of course, headline measures for attainment have changed. But the broad point really is that when we look across a range of different attainment measures, you would see average lower attainment in coastal schools than you would in non-coastal schools. So in that year, average percentage of pupils that were attaining 5 or more A-star to C-grade GCSEs, including English and Maths, was just under 54% for coastal schools compared with 58% in non-coastal schools. This isn't just something we see at Key Stage 4. If you looked at primary school level at the end of Key Stage 2, again, across a range of different attainment measures, you would see lower average performance in coastal schools compared with non-coastal schools. And also, if you didn't look at attainment, but if you looked at Ofsted inspection ratings, for example, you would see a similar story emerging. So if we go on to look at what factors might account for differences in performance between coastal and non-coastal schools. So we tried to summarise this in the chart that's here. In the first bar, you can see in the chart around 4.4% here. This was the gap that you saw between coastal and non-coastal schools. So if you remember, we had about 54% achieving the benchmark for coastal schools, 58% for non-coastal schools. This is our difference, our raw difference. And then what we do is we bring in controls around other school characteristics to look at, is this just about different school characteristics in these areas? And when we take account of differences in school size and type, the gap between coastal and non-coastal schools begins to reduce a bit. And then when we add in further controls around composition of pupil intake in those schools, gender, English as an additional language, special educational needs, again, the gap reduces a bit more. It's really then when we bring in control for the percentage of pupils that are eligible for free school meals that the gap effectively is disappearing. So this points to the difference really reflecting the different levels of deprivation that on average coastal schools would be facing compared with non-coastal schools. And we also see that if we look specifically into bringing in ethnicity as well, of course, there's been lots of debate and attention around performance of white British pupils eligible for free school meals as well. If we look into what happens at Key Stage 2, we see very similar picture. It's the same story. We start with our gap. Once we can account for some of that in terms of differences in school characteristics, but when we bring in measures of disadvantage or proxy of free school meals, again, that can really account for this difference in the gap. We can look at this in a slightly different way. So one limitation of what I've presented so far is that it's comparing coastal schools with schools in all other non-coastal areas. But we know that coastal areas differ in their economic and social characteristics. And so as an alternative way of looking at whether there was a distinct problem, if you like, with coastal schools, for want of better terminology, we identified a subset of non-coastal areas which were more similar in their characteristics to coastal areas. But what we find when we do that, when we compare those areas, is that coastal schools again show lower average attainment, and don't show lower average attainment once you compare them with schools that are located in similar areas at either Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 4. Of course, the focus, particularly in today, and the book is around recruitment and retention. Of course, we're well aware about recruitment and retention challenges, particularly hard for schools located in disadvantaged areas, and of course, been attention on what's happened in coastal areas as part of that. Sometimes we talk about high teacher turnover, quite rightly. And some have highlighted in coastal areas, actually, we may have a problem sometimes with the lack of turnover, difficulties attracting people into certain areas, and also because there may be fewer schools located in these areas, perhaps less other opportunities and so on. So we look a little just as a rough proxy around vacancies in coastal and non-coastal areas. And we see just slightly higher vacancy rates in coastal secondary schools compared to non-coastal schools, although actually the reverse was true for primary. Just to sort of give a sum up of key findings of what the chapter addresses. So we find in common with what others have shown in other analysis, though we sometimes define coastal schools slightly differently. Average attainment is lower in schools that are based in coastal communities compared with non-coastal areas. And that gap's apparent not just at Key Stage 4, but also earlier at Key Stage 2. Part of that is about differences in school characteristics. And then once we account for disadvantage in terms of the percentage of free school meals pupils, we no longer really see a difference in average attainment between coastal and non-coastal schools. Again, if we look at it slightly differently, if we look at coastal schools compared with schools located in similar non-coastal areas, on average, we're not seeing lower levels of attainment. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't think that there isn't a problem for schools that are located in coastal areas, but obviously the deprivation is a key issue here. And doesn't mean either that we might not need to think about how why there are differences between disadvantage in coastal areas compared to disadvantage in other areas. We see slightly higher teacher vacancy rates in secondary schools, coastal areas, at least at the time of this piece of analysis. I think the final thing that's worth saying is, of course, that there's an awful lot of variation in performance of both coastal schools and non-coastal schools. So there are some coastal schools that will be achieving above average levels of attainment despite having a higher proportion of disadvantaged pupils. So perhaps the question here is, what can we learn from the strategies that those schools have adopted, and particularly perhaps in terms of strategies in terms of recruitment and retention? And I will finish there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. As you know, coastal schools are an issue close to both mine and Rowena's heart, and we were delighted when we found out that you were undertaking this research for the Department for Education, and we're glad that it's had an opportunity to get out there through the book and also the links to teacher recruitment and retention. So thank you very much. I'm going to welcome back all of our speakers from the England part of our section today. It's now your chance to air your questions at the chapter authors. So I'm hoping that I can identify from your questions that have come through, and thank you everybody for contributing to this, who they're directed at. So our first one is from Joanna Quinn. Thank you, Joanna. To what extent will the new regulations associated with the early career framework influence teacher recruitment and retention? Now, I think most of our authors could speak on this. So I'm actually going to start, I think, with John to see whether he's got any comment on that. So how do you think the early career framework will influence teacher retention, particularly early career teacher retention?
If I'm honest, I'll say I've no idea, but in previous iterations where we've had this sort of thing, I think it may have a marginal difference. I think there are much bigger influences the economic cycle, which we've already talked about, is one. And the really new development over the last 20 years of the growth of an international school movement servicing the middle classes of many countries, particularly in Asia, China, Malaysia, and increasingly in India, I think is a much bigger influence on whether people want to stay or whether they want to go. Technical changes will affect some people at the margins, but I don't think it'll be a big effect.
Thank you, John. Georgina, I know that you're involved with the all-party parliamentary group for the teaching profession, and there's been quite a lot of discussion in that APPG about the early career framework, as well as the initial teacher training review, market review, up at market in inverted commas, review that's going on. Have you got any feelings about the early career framework and how it might support teacher retention?
I've spent a lot of my day looking at the content of the early career framework, actually. I was a little overawed actually by the amount of the content, and it made me think that perhaps a little bit more time should be allocated to all of these additional activities, because there are a number of different strands of people all striving very much to help to retain teachers in the first couple of years of their working lives. And there's a lot of resources out there, but what it actually results in for those teachers who are grappling with their new timetables and getting to know their classes, and how it can actually be translated into something that is very helpful and developmental on the ground, and not just another thing to deliver to a new career teacher, early career teachers, will be, I think, the question. So how it actually lands with those teachers will be what makes the difference, and whether it's transformational. So actually the interface between the mentors and how they are facilitated in delivering what they're being asked to deliver, and how heavily the accountability framework weighs on it as well. I think the providers are expecting to be inspected, and appropriate bodies will have their role in all of that as well. And if there's a very heavy imprint of the accountability framework on this, it may well affect the way it works for trainees and for the teachers in schools, and that would be detrimental if it were too heavy, I feel. So some good things, but some dangers as well. And of course, awarding QTS at the end of the 2 years is also pushing back that qualification date. So actually now teacher training is a 3-year thing, which makes it look to me like it's fitting into the apprenticeship model.
Thank you, Georgina. I mean, a very sort of comprehensive answer there. It is quite a challenge to see how quite a prescribed framework will work in action until it's actually in place. And I saw Sarah nodding a lot there. So Sarah, would you like to contribute to this? Because I know that you've got lots of experience in considering the way in which new interventions have worked or not, as the case may be, in relation to teacher education.
I think the first thing I'm going to say is what we need to undertake then is robust research on this, for the very reasons Georgina said, that if we don't strike the balance right between the additional workload this brings, and that includes the role of the mentors as well, we need to be undertaking that really rigorous evaluation to see which aspects of this are going to be really working on the ground and which aren't, so that we can actually change it before it rings any death knells if it is going to be too much.
I think it's a really good point there. We know, don't we, from the pilots that that the Institute of Education, UCL, did an evaluation of those to see their effectiveness in supporting those early career teachers. So let's hope that the embedding of an evaluation of the full training programs across the providers, and let's not forget that schools and MATs can actually introduce their own training for early career teachers if they don't want to use the ECF framework through a provider in their own right. Although we do know also that then they have to pay quite a large fee to an appropriate body to sign off their teachers at the end of their QTS period. So lots of unknowns. So we're not sure. Lucy, any contribution?
I think I have much to add really to the expertise of the others on this, but yeah, just to also echo, Georgina and point and the others in you know, we remain to see how regulations turn into things on the ground and in practice, really.
And I think we're all watching with bated breath with this one, aren't we? And we hope that early career teachers get the support that they need, because actually we all want high quality staff development and professional learning within our classrooms. So fingers crossed. We've got a number of other questions coming through. So I'm taking them with the ones that got the most votes. So those of you engaged with us today, please do vote for the questions that you like the most. So from Derek Boyle, how can we equally value trainees of all subjects phases if we apply naked market economics to bursaries? Oh, it's just moved. Primary trainee teachers still need to eat. I would agree with that too. So who would like to go first on this one?
I'll go first again, if we don't mind, because it's a subject which is very dear to my heart. I mean, the answer, Derek, is we can't. It is absolutely disgraceful that we treat some trainee teachers one way and another way. And I always say, when I'm asked about this, the Ministry of Defence does not expect those people training to be tank commanders at Sandhurst to be paid less, those training to be infantry officers. It is absolutely scandalous that the government is applying and has applied these market forces to a preparation for our occupation. It was much better when in 2001 we introduced the bursary for everybody at the same level. I think there are then the serious question of how you get people into the right places in the right schools. And it's fascinating that we've gone back to something that the government of Harold Wilson started in the 1960s. And Mrs. Thatcher then took from primary schools into secondary schools with schools of exceptional difficulty, which is paying a premium for people who work in schools with certain characteristics. But during training, treat everybody the same.
Thank you, John. Absolutely scandalous. You heard it here first, and I'm hoping that's going out on Twitter, because it is. Sarah, Georgina, Lucy, any comments to add to this question?
No, what John said, it's scandalous.
Scandalous, absolutely. Sarah? Nodding as well.
It's the endemic nature of the neoliberalist market agenda, isn't it? So this is part of a bigger question for me, which is how do we fight back against that, actually? Because if we're saying that we value education, that means all subjects, then it's that rhetoric that we need to apply back, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we talk a lot about a neoliberal ideology that's permeating through education, but actually, I think we're hearing it more and more in terms of viewing education as a market, and particularly teachers as a commodity. Lucy, any final comments there?
Can I just put a plug for teachers in a market? Because one of the reasons I came and stayed in teaching was I had much more control of my career than if I'd been a civil servant, where if I upset my boss at some point early in my career and got a bad fitness report, that was effectively my career over. I was much more able to decide when I wanted to leave and where I wanted to apply. The problem we have in education is that we don't have any careers advice for teachers. And once we've got rid of local advisory and inspection services, frankly, there are very few people out there to help guide teachers. And it's not in the interest of schools to do it, because you lose your good teachers. You move on your bad teachers and you forget to tell the good teachers anything about career development.
Thank you, John. And I'm sorry to cut everybody off, because we need more time to have this discussion, but we will be looking at this within a podcast, and all of the questions that you're asking, we will come to when we get to our podcast, if we don't have time to deal with them today. So thank you, England chapter authors. You've done an amazing job today for us. So sharing your information. And I'm now going to move to our international authors, starting with Bart. So over to you, Bart.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Can I double check first that I'm coming through okay on audio?
Yep, all good.
Fab. Lovely. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, Tanya. Thank you for inviting me to this event. It's a real privilege. So very quick introduction for myself. My name is Bart Crisp and I'm at Cure, as already mentioned. As you see on the slide there, Cure is the Centre for the Use of Research and Evidence in Education. This talk is a sort of a micro scale discussion. It's a subset of the work we contributed to the book chapter, but that itself is a subset of some wider research. So as this is a research event, I will start by giving an extremely quick run through of the context of that research. So a few years ago, we were approached by Education International, it's a global union federation of teachers, to explore how different countries construct teachers' professional identities. And they're interested in various different aspects of this, such as you see here through the lenses of things like classroom practices, how these countries handle professional learning and development, how collaboration and networks are involved, various government structures, most obviously accountability systems, what role teacher voice and leadership plays, and then wider social and cultural contexts. With the overall goal of casting some light on how teachers create, access, share and shape their professional knowledge and what that does to them as members of the profession over time. I didn't put a slide in about this, but again, this is an academic event, so a very quick discussion of the methods we used. We started by we identified a series of case study jurisdictions. Some of them are national ones, such as Chile, Kenya, and Sweden. Others were devolved local educational contexts, such as Berlin and Ontario, and they were chosen to be broadly as representative as they could be. So we aimed to have representatives from the global north and global south. We had post-industrial and developing world contexts, Anglosphere and non-Anglosphere. So we're aiming for a reasonably broad spread. Can't be fully emblematic of all of the difference across the world, but we aimed to be broadly representative. And a number of findings emerged from that, in particular with relation to professional development and learning, which we could then put together with a picture about recruitment and retention. And I'll take you through a few interesting things to emerge from that here now. And I think you'll notice a number of overlaps and joins with some of the things that previous speakers have discussed. So early on, just at the kind of the big picture level, the evidence suggests that there are some key building blocks that affect both the development of teachers' professional identities and ultimately, in connection with that, how the recruitment and retention picture evolves in that jurisdiction, which are linked to professional development and learning. The first of which is the provision of good, strong opportunities or pathways for career progression, which value teachers and teaching and not just schooling. So not schooling as purely as a means of outputting learners who have achieved your sort of targets for your cohort, but valuing teaching in its own right and the process of pedagogy and learning. So that was point one. Point number two is positioning teachers as professionals, which I think is very interesting in the context of to the extent to which teachers feel appreciated. But one of the things that emerges that there's value in positioning teachers as professionals who want and need to learn on a continuous basis about their subject and their practice as teachers, rather than as purely practitioners whose work needs to be corrected, who need monitoring and accountability systems wrapped around them. It's about building a more holistic professional learning environment than that. And finally, investment in high quality CPDL in its own right stands out as something that has positive benefits for recruitment and retention. And then one final note here, which I'll explore in a little more detail in a moment, but CPDL is not a silver bullet when it comes to recruitment and retention, or for that matter, anything else. It can become a problem if the high levels of CPDL that policymakers want to see are created. It says here as an entitlement, but the problem really becomes when it becomes an obligation, and it lacks the resourcing, ring fencing and sort of capacity being installed around it in order to ensure that teachers can access professional learning sort of smoothly and effectively. Drilling into that a little more detail, a point at the top, a sort of caveat, if you like. Obviously, local ecologies matter enormously. These are very disparate systems that we were looking at. With some of them were national, some of them weren't. They have very different pipelines, different populations, different all sorts of different specific challenges they were dealing with. Having said that, teaching is a profession with some consistent underpinning principles and practices and requirements associated with it. So there are similarly coherent themes for professional learning. So, pedagogy, and by and large, there's a consistent finding that teachers generally find CPD valuable. Often they like it, and therefore there are links between CPD and retention wherever you look, even though it gets more complicated than that when you dig under the surface. Again, more CPD is not necessarily better, and we're able to identify some particular practices in CPD that were powerful. High quality diagnostic analysis of capacity at the system level, so that the support that is provided via professional development can identify and build on strengths, as well as addressing areas for development. And in general, a focus on quality of CPD is more pressing and prevalent for general benefits, including recruitment and retention, than merely upping the quantum of professional learning that teachers receive. One point, this is a bit of a water is wet finding, but it's still useful to have it in writing. CPD support needs to be matched to the complexity of the improvement goal or task that you have set. So if you're trying to we heard just now that if you're radically upping your provision of ITT requirements, then you have to scale that. Again, there's much more detail here we could go into. If you want to find out more, do make sure to check the chapter, but I will quickly show you a graphic that illustrates this particular point quite vividly. So we charted here, as you see, system performance against levels of participation in professional development and learning. And as you can see, it's a complex relationship. You can increase CPD participation without necessarily increasing system performance. And so, you need to think about the quality, but if you have reasonable expectation of high quality professional learning installed in the system, then increasing the quantum does have benefits, as you see comparing Berlin, Ontario, and Singapore here. So I have to wrap up. There's a great deal more detail that would be good to go into. There's a work-life balance point that I think might be worth discussing more later on, which is basically, again, just upping the quantum and mandating things doesn't automatically fix a problem. You need to think about the factors that go into it. But I just want to quickly wrap up, because I know time is tight, by noting some conclusions that we drew from the research, which were basically fourfold. Investing in promotion and celebration of teachers and teaching, and promoting the status as a profession, having people generally see teaching as appealing, and the reserve of effective individuals is definitely a high value approach to adopt from a policy perspective. Focusing on quality of CPD, I've mentioned several times the importance of it, and using this to build a sophisticated picture of the effectiveness of CPD and what the profession's demands are, is also a very powerful sort of policy fix you can seek to deploy. Developing teacher-led education systems, I haven't had a chance to speak about that so much, but one of the things we found in this research is that creating professional learning in which teachers perceive that they are learning from their colleagues and peers, as opposed to having stuff sort of directed at them, seems to have a powerful positive effect. And finally, giving attention to how the system structures affect and model trust in teachers. So to what extent your system signals that you treat teachers or view teachers as professional experts. These are all things that the evidence would suggest are powerful levers for policy development. Apologies for having to rush, but I will resolve it there.
That's great. Thank you, Bart. And I do love the water is wet analogy, but sometimes, you have to put the evidence where it appears obvious to us working in education, just to make sure that everything is robust in the way in which we're making our recommendations. So thank you very much, Bart, and look forward to speaking to you in a moment when we get to our questions. We're now going to look at the Chinese experience, and we have Hongang who is joining us. Hi, Hongang. I can't speak anymore. It's been a very long day.
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. Lovely to see you. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the seminar. Thank you for your interest in the topic. Well, thank you for Tanya and Rowena for your invitation. Returning Teachers is a systematic project involving multiple factors, from the macro level of implementing positive education policies to the macro level of organizing various programs of teacher training. So my friend Dongqiang Li and I co-authored this current chapter focusing on high school teacher retention solutions in the Chinese context. Dongqiang Li is pursuing his PhD in Griffith University, Australia, and I'm Honggang Liu. I'm full professor of applied linguistics in the Department of English, Northeast Normal University in China. For the limitation of time, we would like to present today's, sorry, not move on. Oh, this is a bit slow. So I'd like to spend some time, very quick look at the policies of to recruit the outstanding candidates in the teacher education, as well as the policy to retain the teachers. And then we would like to move on to the current study. Well, in China, in order to enlist more outstanding high school students to receive 4-year teacher education in 6 selected top normal universities, and to recruit the outstanding candidates into the teaching profession, especially into teaching in rural areas after their graduation. So the Ministry of Education in China, the Ministry of Education in China implemented free teacher education policy in 2007, and in 2016. In 2018, this FTE policy was renamed as public funded teacher education, that is PFTE policy. But we found some changes of the names, but we can find some core parts shared by the two policies, that is 2 free and 1 support. Free what? Free of tuition, free accommodation, and the great support, that is 600 yuan per month for the candidates as a stipend for them. After their graduation, they are required to work for 6 to 10 years in the rural areas or in some in their home provinces. And this is the requirement for the graduates. And in 2012, 1 year after the first group of FTE graduates have worked for a year, the Ministry of Education of China piloted the implementation measures of master's degree in education program for FTE graduates implemented in normal universities under the supervision of Ministry of Education. And the graduates in the FTE have the opportunity to further their study as MA candidates to pursue their MA degree without the entry examination, but they will be strictly examined in terms of their qualification. And the 2 programs are now continuing. Well, our current study is focusing on the effects of the 2 programs, and we focus on how they retain the teachers. So the participants, I'm sorry, there's a lag of this slide. Well, the current study, we focus on the EFL teachers EFL teacher, 1 interviewee, that is Thomas, He's a graduate from FTE, and he's pursuing his MA in the MTE master degree. And this research is conducted in a university-based training program. And in this training program, there are 60 English teachers. And questions are the effects of training, relationship between in-service training and teacher retention. Now, let's see the summary of the 2 interviews. One interview was carried out in 2015 after the training, and another interview was carried out in 2018. From the comparison between the 2 interviews, we can find the big change in terms of the attitudes towards the teaching and their states. Well, from this table, I summarized this table based on the interview abstracts. Well, in 2015, after the training, Thomas told me that he was burned out, well, by the overwork, and he had the intention to leave this job. And after the training, Thomas told me, yes, he was fully involved in the training, and he has the plan to stay in the school for a period to see whether he could work for a longer period. And it seems that he was remotivated and built up the confidence. And after 3 years, when I met Thomas and have another interview, he told me, okay, I once told you that I was burnt out, and my teaching was not effective. It was not effective, and I felt burdensome in teaching and unhappiness. But after that, that training, I felt happier and stayed in the current post for at least 10 years, and I can distribute my time and energy to the current work in a balanced way. So shall we come to the finding? Next page. Yes. Well, from the data, we can see that these 2 programs place the function of retaining of teachers, not only recruit the candidates for the teacher education program. And the in-service teacher training is necessary, and it could empower the teachers in terms of their professional knowledge, reflective skills, and capacity to undertake research to improve their teaching. Well, thank you. I'm so sorry for the trouble in, well, showing the slides.
Hongyang, thank you so much. These technicalities are sent to try us, and we know as teachers, don't we, that we usually have backups if we're face-to-face and using remote. I found that incredibly interesting, and I know from your chapter that the additionality and enhancements that the teachers had on your program really did help them in terms of staying in their careers and retaining them within China and within your province. So thank you, Hongyang.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to move now to Israel and to Smarda. So thank you, Smarda.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yep, it's all good.
I'll be presenting the context, the Israeli context in terms of shortages and surplus of teachers. And I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Ruth Zozowski. The Israeli context is Israel is a very segregated country. Its current population of about 9 million people is divided into 2 main sectors. The first one is the Jewish sector, which makes up about 75% of the total population. It's about 7 million people. And their language, and they speak Hebrew, which is also the official language of Israel. And we've got the Arab sector, who comprise 20% of the population and make up about 2 million people, and they speak Arabic as their first language. Now, the 2 education systems, the education system is completely separated for the 2 sectors. Jews study in Jewish or Hebrew schools, and the medium of instruction is Hebrew. These are mostly state schools, and the teachers who teach in these schools are Hebrew-speaking teachers. The education system for the Arab students is conducted in Arabic. Again, these are mostly state schools, and the teachers are Arabic-speaking teachers. This situation also reflects on the teacher education system. We've got 21 teacher education colleges in Israel, and 19 belong to the Jewish sector. And again, medium of instruction there is in Hebrew, and 3 belong to the Arab sector, and the medium of instruction is Arabic. So this gives you a sense of what's going on in terms of the education system. Now, what can we say about teachers in teaching in Israel? And so when we compare Israel to other countries, and we can see here results from the OECD 2018, we can see that teachers' salaries, for example, are fairly low compared to other countries. These are taken from the upper secondary with teachers with 15 years of experience. But even if we compare other levels of education, we get the same pattern. So salaries are fairly low. Teacher salaries are also low within Israel when they are compared to other professions in Israel. This is from the Central Bureau of Statistics, and of average and we can see the total average, and we can see that education and teachers is below the average. When we look at class size, it is larger. Again, this is taken from the OECD comparisons. Class size is larger than most countries. And again, we see here that this is the lower secondary education, but even if we look at other levels, the results are, the pattern is the same. When we look at workload, how much do teachers work? We can see that we are somewhere in the average. So we don't work less than other countries. And by the way, when I showed class size, this means when we've got largest class sizes, it means crowded classes, more work, and more issues of classroom discipline. So given this situation, it is perhaps not surprising that teacher status in Israel is not high. These results are taken from an international survey conducted in 2018. It compared 35 countries worldwide, and we can see they have their global teacher status index made up of a few items, and you can see that Israel ranks fairly at the bottom. So having said that, and my question to you is, given the unattractiveness of Israel teaching profession and the low status that I've just showed, what do you think this might lead to? And we've got 4 options here. Would it, 1, teacher shortages in both sectors, Jews and Arabs, teacher surplus in both sectors, shortage in the Jewish sector, surplus in the Arab, or vice versa, surplus in the Jewish and shortage in the Arab sector? And I'll move to the next slide to allow you to answer. Okay, so these are the results. Most of you say shortages in the Jewish sector, surplus in the Arab. Well, this is the correct answer, although it makes much more sense to, according to the data that I showed you, according to what I showed you, to say that there will be shortages in both sectors. Now, it makes a lot of sense that there will be shortages in the Jewish sector. And the Jewish sector, indeed, it is extremely difficult to recruit teachers. It is difficult to retain teachers. And there is an ongoing acute teacher shortages for the last 20 years at least, if not even more. And the shortages exist in most school subjects and at all school levels. And what happens in reality is that school principals hire unemployed, unqualified teacher to fill in the vacant positions. In the Arab sector, on the other hand, we've got a completely different picture. It is much easier to recruit teachers, easier to retain them. And in fact, there is a huge, massive surplus of teachers in all school subjects and at all school levels. And what happens here is that there is an extensive list of unemployed qualified teachers. And in fact, it can take up until 7 years for a qualified teacher to find a teaching position. And many of them find themselves working part-time. So I think it's quite clear why are these the results in the Jewish sector, but it needs explanation of what's going on in the Arab one. So the reasons for the teacher surplus in the Arab sector is because Arabs are a minority, only 20% of the population. Arab academics encounter numerous problems, mostly social and cultural, and find it difficult to integrate into the labor market, which is dominated mostly by the majority, by the Jews. So most Arabs prefer holding to stable public sector positions and become civil servants so that they have occupational security, tenure, and nobody can fire them. And they also prefer to work next to their homes, and most of them live in their own villages, and to use their first language, so to use Arabic at work. And so the most popular occupations are amongst the Arab population is the healthcare profession, which is nursing, medicine, pharmacology, and also teaching. In the past few years, the government and the Ministry of Education has conducted a few actions to solve the problems in the Jewish sector and also in the Arab sector. But I think what has to be conducted is Arabs should be teaching in Jewish schools, because this is a win-win situation, which does not happen enough. And it's going to allow us to promote democratic culture and strengthen coexistence. And this is something that has to be done in future years. And I'll stop here.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Smarda. I mean, it's such an interesting dichotomy that you have in Israel. And I think your chapter really brought that out. And it's really interesting as well to hear you talk about unqualified teachers, which I know Sarah talked about in her presentation. And I've looked into more extensively, both in England and internationally. And we know we've got growing numbers of unqualified, uncertified teachers internationally, which kind of feeds into this idea of teaching within a market rather than teaching within a profession. So thank you, Smart. That was really interesting. And I know we're going to get some great questions coming through for you in a moment. We're going straight over to Australia now and to Phil. It's very late or early in the morning, whichever way you want to look at it. So Phil, over to you.
Good morning, Tanya, and good morning, everyone. I just want to note that I'm speaking with you today from the lands of the Gundungara people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And I'm also speaking on behalf of my colleague Natalie, who works on most of this material with me. Now, I'm particularly interested in the issue of urbanisation, or more so, who's left behind in urbanisation. We're in a situation in the world now where half the population lives in urban spaces. This has been the norm for a little bit longer in some parts of the world. And in countries like where I'm speaking to you from, we have a very high level of concentration here as well. Now, as the urban population becomes the majority, what we see is the normal experience of human existence and the spaces in which we occupy changes. And everywhere that's left behind somewhat becomes deviant from that. Interesting analogies or comparisons with what's been said earlier about coastal communities, where most people in Australia live within the coast because that's the desired outcome, etc., which means the other areas are less populated. What does it look like in a spatial sense when I refer to Australia? Well, the yellow there on the map on the left is population density, and we can see a clustering around the southeast corner and the coast. A lot of areas where there's very low population density. The no population is a bit of a statistical misnomer, which we might talk about at other times. On the right-hand side, you can see a change in population density there. All the light colour is where population is declining. So the trend is even increasing in Australia. The couple of places where it is not are mining communities, which have a workforce growth related to a mine. We have a number of characteristics of non-urban places. On the left there, things like ageing, less access to healthcare, population decline, reduced economic activity, and educational outcomes and hard to staff issues resulting there. Same issues around health and education apply, and other professions. And educationally, we have things like less access to early childhood, matriculation, less senior completion, and so forth. So this is what we class as the wicked problem, to use that phrase. And this is not just an Australian phenomenon. This accords actually comes from work from the United States around rural communities and changing rural communities in the last 50 to 60 years. And we've seen the impact of that in global politics around rural voting patterns and so forth. So this creates a view of the rural as being problematic, disadvantaged, and deficit discourses prevail, which has an impact then on the desirability for professionals and others, and how we view the people that remain. We classify rural places in Australia using statistics, and those statistics are organised around population density and proximity to that population density. So again, the idea of the urban as being the normal pervades even the way we define geographic space. And this then flows through to then how we measure student outcomes and how we compare students with these raw cuts around achievement levels in populations where there's high density and large schools to populations where there's lower density and so forth. So it becomes a comparative measure. So I'm interested in how we imagine this. How do we deal with those deficits, how are they produced, and what do we think is the normal scenario, and what do we think normal school sizes are, what do teachers think are desirable communities to live in, and so forth. On one instance, we have the idea on the right, as you've seen a pattern throughout these slides, of where people live as being on that coastal strip in the southeast. But 230 years ago, before the Europeans came to these lands, there were and still are numbers of First Nations communities living. This is the map on the left of language groups around Australia, about 270 odd language groups at the time of European settlement 230 years ago. So this is not land that is unoccupied. It's land with a long history of occupation. And when we talk to the communities in those locations, and we talk to people who have moved to those locations in the last 230 years, they'll use language like, well, the city is remote to us, where we might use language that they're remote to the city. So perspective matters here. I like this particular picture. I use it a lot because it's a famous painting from the late 1800s of Hobart. And you can see that in the distance there where the sun is shining is the emerging Hobart town. And in the foreground, in the dark, or we look past to the light, is the populations of the Mawanina and Palawa people who were the occupants of that land. This is reflected in the way we do education in Australia. Education was always rolled out to civilise and control space beyond the city, and it was always from the centre out. So this idea of there being something to be overcome and replaced has been a pervading attitude. Theoretically, the ideas of the rural as being real and imagined comes in here. So when we have popular culture or language of the rural being sidelined, that becomes problematic. And then we think about, well, what is normal? We have the trilectic of space from Soja and Hopland and Lefebvre around rural being perceived, conceived, and lived, or we have the spatial justice sense of, what is justice? Do we think of justice as a redistribution of resources to those places left behind, or do we see it as valuing places in their diversity and changing the historical narrative? And we had talk about teachers' supply, and we see in this slide, for instance, this is a couple of days ago, we have staffing issues that are huge. Might be more blue than red on some of that map, but when the schools have 4 or 5 teachers having up to 5 shortages, becomes like 100% of staff. And that's because of the desirability. So a few things then about how we're dealing with that. We've been doing work on literature reviews in the top half there, looking at how we staff schools. And the key finding of our literature work, for instance, is that we've been doing the same thing for a long time and haven't been changing the outcomes, which is interesting because in the one I mentioned at the bottom here, the rural difference trope, well, our principles talk about working in rural schools is particularly distinct and different. The different social relation to working with communities, both in terms of the proximity and your visibility in those communities, but also in terms of the issues and social issues you're dealing with and the lack of access to services and so forth. So it's a different professional type of work. And two quick things that I'll mention here, a couple of monographs of ours where we've been looking at things like incentives. And the key points I want to say about these incentives is, this is the key way we try to get teachers into some of these schools. We incentivize them to go. But incentives reinforces a deficit because you're overcoming something. But the other really interesting part of this analysis is that they all assume that humans are motivated by sort of capital reasons. The nature of the professional practice, as has been talked about by my colleagues internationally, is not engaged within the incentive structure, but that's what people are crying out for in our research. And finally, the last thing I'll mention is when we think about this research around staffing rural schools in Australia, and there's a whole range of influences here that are about the production of space. So the work around isolation that mirrors the work that Tanya and others have done. Isolation is viewed differently by different people. Some people who grew up and lived in these communities would not want to work in the city and can't stand the city, but it's not constructed in that way in this system. Standards and regulation basically work in terms of, well, here is a standardized notion of teaching that as we measured in a city school, and we take that out as being quality in a rural school where there's different social dynamics and issues, and that creates tensions. So the key finding here is that this metronormativity notion pervades here through all of this stuff. One of the key issues that really gets on my goat here, and this is the point I'll finish on, is that we've been doing the same thing as researchers in this space for as long as I can find the research talking about it, and we haven't changed what we're doing. We need to do something different. Going over the same ground isn't helping that, and what's missing is that notion of thinking about places as distinct and different in that social notion of spatial justice. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Phil. I mean, again, another area that's close to mine and Marina's heart, looking at this rural-urban classification in England, it's very similar in terms of outcomes for our pupils and our schools and teacher retention and recruitment as it is in Australia. And, you know, from our perspective, it's very much to do with metronormativity and focusing on the urban and seeing that deficit model as something to overcome and something to fix rather than embrace. And you know, we know that actually we've got a large percentage of rurality within England, so why see it as deficit? Thank you, Phil, and thank you everyone for coming back for our Q&A. We've got some great questions coming through, and I'm going to go with the most popular for this half. We've also got our questions still on our Slido from the previous section. If we have time, we'll come to them, but I doubt if we will. So we're going to start with Sean Hayes. So thank you, Sean. It's based around Israel, but it was interesting, I think, to have other people's perceptions on this. So SMARTA to start with, the Israeli presentation echoes the Northern Ireland situation in relation to teachers teaching in schools of their own religion and not crossing the divide. I mean, it's a really good question. Have you got any reflections on this? We'll start with SMARTA, but actually I'd like to ask everybody this.
We're actually trying to imitate what's going on in Northern Ireland. We're using the shared education model today, or at least we're trying to, take the shared education model and to bring it to Israel. But it's conducted now in it's in the pilot stages, conducted in very few schools. But this is the way to go. This is definitely the way to go, to use the Duffy and Gallagher model, and that's where we're aiming. And we've got lots of contacts with Northern Ireland to try and learn from them how to go about it.
That's really interesting, SMARTA, isn't it? That you're already looking at that and what's worked within Northern Ireland so far to try and mitigate the challenges that have been brought about by the different faiths and the challenges that they've had in the past. I don't know if that's something that's happened in China, Hongang, that you could comment on.
Well, in China, I think the policies are consistent, and what I mentioned, the two policies are still implemented, and they, well, on the one hand, they aim to recruit more outstanding candidates, but on the other hand, they really play the function of retaining the teachers in their post. Well, in my presentation, I want to highlight that in the two programs, especially the second, the master degree program, the training offline, online, are both beneficial for the in-service teachers to retain in their post. So I think policy level should be highlighted in when we are talking about the teacher retention or to avoid the turnover.
Thank you, Hong Ang. So a focus on policy. I don't know, Bart, Phil, you've got any comments on this? And there is a question for you as well, specifically, Bart, in a moment, just to let you know.
Thanks for the heads up. I'm happy for Phil to go first on the question.
Yeah, I think we have a high degree of privatisation in Australia. So we have a whole degree of segregation, both of students and the teachers who come from certain religious backgrounds that manage schools, up to 45, 50% some schools in some regions. But the issue more for us is that we don't have very many First Nations teachers in schools that are dominated by First Nations students, and the proportion of the teachers versus population is significantly mismatched, and that's the same for a whole range of minority groups in the urban areas. So we have a very 90% of our teachers have a Commonwealth nation history, shall we say. That's not the population makeup of Australia.
Thanks, Phil. I know that there will be countries that share that experience. I know within England, we have, I think by the very term, issues around schools where we don't have enough BAME teachers for the populations of pupils within those schools as well. But
yeah, I mean, this is a great question, I think, and I agree that the parallels between Israel and Northern Ireland are really intriguing, and also Australia. But the religious conflict angle is particularly striking there. In terms of the research that we were doing, the thing that stands out to me, and something I had to gloss over a bit in my presentation for time reasons, one of the things we explored was teachers' values. And one of the things we found very gratifyingly was that the thing that they were least motivated by consistently across each system was getting students to succeed in formal examinations. They recognized that was an integral part of the job, but it wasn't the thing that motivated them. And therefore, it wasn't a particularly useful thing to focus on from a policy perspective in terms of driving their satisfaction. They were much more interested in supporting students in becoming learners, becoming citizens. The things that were the most important driver for teachers did vary a bit between systems, but they were generally much more interested in supporting the students as young people and helping them to become the best versions of themselves they could be, sort of in the round. So the point that Smada wrapped up with about the kind of the community effects that you can foster by by focusing your policy on reducing or removing segregation in your teaching provision seems to me to be eminently sensible and a good thing from all kinds of different angles. Yeah.
And refocusing away from performativity and accountability, maybe. Yeah. But there's a couple of questions for you. One again from Derek Boyle that's high up on the charts in terms of popularity, and it crosses over with one from Philly Eigelhart as well. So I'm going to read Derek's, which is pretty similar to Philly's. How do we provide an adaptive framework of CPDL that teachers can access according to their own professional development interests and needs? I know Kyria's been working on this quite extensively anyway. And just to sort of touch in on Philly's one as well, has your research found any link between the types of CPDL and professionalization of teaching? And it's interesting that she said professionalization of teaching rather than re-professionalization, because I think we've been going through a de-professionalization of teaching as a consequence of unqualified teachers, it not being a postgraduate profession anymore in England and all of those things. So, CPDL, professionalisation, you know, what do we do?
You've effectively reframed that into a very revealing question, which is that this is a, you know, you could have a symposium or several of them on these topics in their own right. I'll try and give brief answers. I think, you know, if you're in terms of CPDL approaches, we have been doing a lot of work on this as part of various different projects, and we publish research on elements of it. Also, Vivian Robinson from New Zealand has done some great work on you know, how to lead CPDL effectively, and what good practices you know, should be focused on as part of that process. We would the two I would kind of pick on as being the sort of probably the factoring everything in, the best options would be coaching. Good quality professional coaching is a really powerful, you know, high leverage approach to CPDL, and then making sure you're making good use of what Vivian Robinson defines as smart tools, which are tools that are designed very carefully to achieve particular professional learning purposes, that help the users manage the cognitive and emotional load of the professional learning they're trying to engage in, which take account of their starting points and a number of other factors that she lays out. So those are two that I think are, you know, useful ways of reprofessionalizing, because they allow people to access complexity in a manageable and effective way, and they respect the autonomy and the kind of personal circumstances of the users. Similar adaptive CPDL is a really fascinating topic. I think, you know, again, I would say coaching and smart, using carefully designed smart tools will be integral there. But I think also I would also zoom out one more level and focus on the leadership of CPDL. I think, you know, CPDL cannot be mandated. Effective CPDL cannot be mandated centrally. You know, that you need to have some principles that need to be in place that everyone is aware of, but then you need you need to be able to you know, locate the choices about the CPDL that is commissioned and accessed at leadership level, and then make sure that your leaders are also consulting their colleagues about what they need as well. That's the best I can do to provide a glib answer to a really huge, fascinating and important topic.
I mean, it is absolutely huge, and the coaching kind of overlaps, doesn't it, into the ECF question. I know there's another ECF question that we've been posed by Deb Outhwaite, the Early Career Framework. Phil and Smarda and Hong Ang, in terms of continuing professional development and learning, Bart's just said that trust, autonomy and leadership, or leadership buy-in actually, isn't it, into that professional learning that their staff are undertaking, are key components for making it effective, for a kind of re-professionalizing of the teaching profession. Any comments there in relation to your own country's experiences?
Look, I'd make a comment from a rural perspective, in that the challenge we have is valuing diversity in that. So often the training that is available is imagining a school that's in a city with a lot of kids and a lot of teachers, and that's not the case in the middle schools we work with. But they have to re-articulate the frameworks in their contexts, and that then becomes a, you know, am I doing the right thing? So a bit of a sort of a conflict as to whether they're doing the appropriate thing or not, and that's an issue we're facing in that space, in our particular rural space. So.
Thank you, Phil. I know that's an issue that we had pre-pandemic that seems to have been helped by remote learning opportunities. Hong Ang?
I have nothing to add. I think Philip and Bart have given us enough elaborations on this topic. Thank you for their elaborations.
Thanks, Hong Ang. And final word to Smarda before we wrap up today. It's gone so quickly.
Yeah, I'll just say that Israel is a very centralized country, and right now teachers unfortunately are not trusted enough and do not have enough autonomy. And this is something that people are definitely speaking about here, about the need to provide teachers with more trust, more autonomy. This is the way to go about it.
Thank you, Smarda, and thank you every one of our authors today from Exploring Teacher Recruitment and Retention. It was a pleasure working with them for Rowena and I when we were editing the book, and it's been a pleasure today speaking with them. I'm very much looking forward to the podcast. So just to sum up from everything that we've heard today, we understand that teaching and professional development and learning within teaching is complex. We know that governments and those that control teacher education have tried to put interventions in place with a one-size-fits-all. And that's been quite challenging because many of those that control teacher supply are linked to a kind of market reference of commodity versus professional, and that we understand, as we're experienced within teacher education, have been doing this for many years, that actually treating teachers as a commodity and teaching the market as such, in terms of teacher training and teacher supply, has not been effective in making sure that we recruit and retain enough teachers in most of our countries, in most of our areas, and that sometimes the way in which we treat our teachers can lead to an oversupply as well in certain regions, as we've heard from Smarda. So I think the message that we take away from this is very much treat teachers as the professionals they are, look at teaching as a profession and not a market, and really listen. Those who control workforce supply in teaching, listen to those who have robust research and evidence about what works and what could work to sustain and replenish and allow our teachers to flourish, and actually show their kind of appreciation of being a teacher in the way that they want to, rather than making them feel like they lack control and therefore leave. Thank you everyone for your time today and joining us. Thanks from both of our special interest groups at BERA. So that's mine and Anika's, which is Educational Effectiveness Improvement, and Sarah and Rowena's, which is Educational Policy Making and Research. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care and thank you.